The sky had been threatening rain all afternoon, but when the heavens finally opened up over Trinity, Texas, it came down with such fury that people said later they had never seen anything quite like it in all of 1878. Josephine Norwood stood at the edge of town, drenched to the bone in her pale blue cotton dress that now clung to her like a second skin, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely draw breath. She had been traveling for 3 days from Houston after receiving word that her aunt had taken ill, but the stagecoach had lost a wheel just 2 miles outside of Trinity, and the driver had sent her walking toward town while he stayed behind to fix it. That had been over an hour ago, and the storm had caught her completely unprepared. Her thin shawl lay somewhere in the mud behind her, torn from her shoulders by the wind, and her small traveling bag had been abandoned when it became too heavy to carry. Now she could barely feel her fingers or toes, and her vision was starting to blur around the edges. She stumbled forward, her boots squelching in the mud, and nearly fell when her foot caught on something. Strong hands caught her before she hit the ground, and she looked up through the driving rain to see a man with dark hair plastered to his forehead and concerned gray eyes studying her face. "Madam, you are going to freeze to death out here," he said, his voice cutting through the roar of the storm. Without waiting for her response, he released her long enough to shrug out of his heavy canvas coat, revealing a worn cotton shirt that immediately began to darken with rain. He draped the coat around her shoulders, and the warmth that lingered in it felt like the most precious thing she had ever experienced. "But you will get soaked," she managed to say through her chattering teeth, trying to push the coat back toward him. "I have been soaked before, and I will be soaked again," he said firmly, pulling the coat more securely around her. "Come on, my horse is just over there. Can you walk?" She nodded, though she was not entirely certain she could. He kept one hand on her elbow, steadying her as they made their way through the downpour to where a large bay horse stood with its head down against the storm. The man lifted her into the saddle with surprising ease, then swung up behind her, one arm coming around her waist to hold her steady as he urged the horse forward. Josephine wanted to ask his name, wanted to thank him properly, but her body was shaking so hard she could not form the words. She could feel him behind her, solid and warm despite the rain that continued to pour down on him, and she leaned back slightly against his chest without thinking. His arm tightened around her, and she heard him make a soft sound of concern. "Not much farther now," he said near her ear. "Doc Pritchard lives just up ahead. We will get you warm and dry." True to his word, within minutes, they were pulling up in front of a small house with a sign that read "Medical Services" hanging beside the door. The man dismounted and lifted Josephine down, keeping his arm around her as he half carried her up the steps and pounded on the door with his free hand. An older man with white hair and spectacles opened the door, took one look at them, and stepped back immediately. "Thomas Norton, what have you brought me?" "Found her walking in from the East Road," Thomas said, guiding Josephine inside. "Stage broke down from what I could gather. She is frozen through." "Get her by the fire," Doc Pritchard said, already moving toward a cabinet. "Mrs. Pritchard," he called toward the back of the house, "bring some blankets and hot water." Thomas led Josephine to a chair near the fireplace, where flames were already crackling cheerfully. He knelt down and began unlacing her muddy boots, and she made a weak sound of protest. "Let me help," he said quietly, looking up at her. "Your fingers will not work right now anyway." He was right. She could barely move them. She watched as he carefully removed her boots and then her stockings, which were soaked through and caked with mud. His hands were gentle despite their obvious strength, and when Mrs. Pritchard appeared with towels, he took one and began carefully drying Josephine's feet. The gesture was so intimate and yet so innocent that she felt tears spring to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, finding her voice at last. He looked up at her again, and for the first time she really saw his face. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with strong features that spoke of both determination and kindness. There was a small scar above his left eyebrow, and his gray eyes held a depth that suggested he had seen more than his fair share of hardship. "You are welcome," he said simply. Then he stood and stepped back as Mrs. Pritchard took over, wrapping Josephine in thick blankets and pressing a cup of hot tea into her hands. "You should go get yourself dried off too, Thomas," Doc Pritchard said, studying the younger man with a critical eye. "You are dripping all over my floor." "I will head home in a minute," Thomas said, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he stood near the fireplace, his arms crossed over his chest, watching as color slowly began to return to Josephine's cheeks. "Stubborn as always," Mrs. Pritchard muttered, but there was affection in her tone. She turned to Josephine. "Now, dear, what is your name and what brings you to Trinity?" "Josephine Norwood," she said, her voice stronger now as the warmth began to seep back into her body. "I came from Houston to see my aunt, Sarah Jenkins. I received a telegram saying she was ill." "Sarah Jenkins," Doc Pritchard repeated, exchanging a glance with his wife. "She lives out at the old Henderson place, does she not?" "Yes, that is right," Josephine said. "Do you know if she is all right? The telegram was not very detailed." Doc Pritchard's expression grew somber. "I am afraid I have not been called out to see her, which likely means she either recovered or has not wanted medical attention. The Henderson place is about 4 miles west of here, near the creek." "4 miles," Josephine repeated faintly. After her ordeal in the storm, the distance seemed insurmountable. "You will not be going anywhere tonight," Mrs. Pritchard said firmly. "The storm shows no signs of letting up and you need rest and food. We have a spare room upstairs. You will stay here until morning." "I could not impose," Josephine began, but Thomas spoke up from his position near the fire. "She is right. The roads will be nothing but mud and water tonight. It would not be safe." He paused, then added, "I could ride out to the Henderson place and let your aunt know you have arrived safely in town if you would like." "In this weather?" Josephine looked at him with alarm. "No, you have done more than enough already. I will not have you risk yourself further on my account." Something flickered in his eyes at her words, something that might have been pleasure or surprise. "It is no trouble," he said. "I know the way well, and my horse is sure-footed even in poor conditions." "Thomas Norton, you will do no such thing, Mrs. Pritchard said with the authority of someone who had known him since childhood. "You will go home, get into dry clothes, and have a hot meal. Miss Norwood can send word to her aunt in the morning when the storm has passed." Thomas looked as though he might argue, but then he simply nodded. "Yes, madam." He turned to Josephine. "I am glad you are all right, Miss Norwood. Welcome to Trinity." "Thank you again, Mr. Norton," she said, meeting his eyes. "I cannot express how grateful I am for your kindness." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once and headed for the door. She watched him go, noticing the way his wet shirt clung to his broad shoulders, the confident set of his stride despite the fact that he must be nearly as cold as she had been. The door closed behind him, and she felt an odd sense of loss, as though something important had just walked out of her life before she had even had a chance to understand what it was. "That Thomas Norton is one of the good ones," Mrs. Pritchard said, breaking into her thoughts. "Runs a small ranch about 3 miles north of town. Lost his parents to fever 6 years back and has been managing on his own ever since. Works harder than any 3 men I know." "He was very kind," Josephine said softly, pulling the blankets more tightly around herself. She could still feel the warmth of his coat, which lay draped over the back of her chair, and without thinking she reached out to touch it. "Come along now," Mrs. Pritchard said. "Let us get you upstairs and into some dry clothes. I think I have something that will fit you well enough for tonight." Josephine allowed herself to be led up the narrow staircase to a small but clean room with a quilt-covered bed and a washstand. Mrs. Pritchard brought her a nightgown and helped her out of her wet dress, clucking sympathetically over the state of her things. "We will hang these by the kitchen fire overnight," she said. "They should be mostly dry by morning. Now you get into bed and rest. I will bring you up some dinner in a bit." Left alone, Josephine climbed into the bed and pulled the quilts up to her chin. The room was warm and comfortable, but she found she could not stop thinking about Thomas Norton standing in the rain, giving her his coat without a moment's hesitation. She had known wealthy men in Houston who would not have crossed the street to help someone in distress. Yet this cowboy had quite literally given her the coat off his back and asked for nothing in return. She wondered if she would see him again before she had to leave Trinity. The thought that she might not filled her with an unexpected melancholy. Mrs. Pritchard brought her a tray laden with beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie, and Josephine discovered that she was ravenous. She ate every bite and then fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the window and the sound of birdsong filled the air. It was as though the storm had never happened, except for the mud that still clung to the street outside and the puddles that reflected the blue sky like mirrors. Her dress, while not completely dry, was wearable, and she dressed quickly before making her way downstairs. She found Doc and Mrs. Pritchard in the kitchen, and they greeted her warmly. "You have much better color this morning," Doc Pritchard observed. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you," Josephine said. "I cannot thank you enough for your hospitality." "Think nothing of it," Mrs. Pritchard said. "Now sit down and have some breakfast. After that we will figure out how to get you to your aunt's place." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Doc Pritchard went to answer it, and Josephine heard a familiar voice that made her heart skip unexpectedly. "Good morning, Doc. I came to see if Miss Norwood needed transportation to the Henderson place." Thomas Norton appeared in the kitchen doorway, hat in hand, looking considerably better than he had the night before. His dark hair was neatly combed, his clothes were clean and dry, and his gray eyes found Josephine immediately. "Mr. Norton," she said, rising from her chair. "You did not need to trouble yourself." "It is no trouble," he said again, and she was beginning to think it was something of a habit with him. "I have business out that way today anyway, and it would be my pleasure to escort you." She wanted to say yes immediately, but forced herself to hesitate. "I do not wish to be a burden." "You are not," he said simply. "Besides, your aunt will want to know you arrived safely. I rode out there last night after all, despite Mrs. Pritchard's orders, and told her you would be coming this morning." "Thomas Norton, you did no such thing, Mrs. Pritchard said, but she was smiling. "You are going to catch your death one of these days." "Not likely," he said with a grin that transformed his serious face into something considerably more charming. "So, Miss Norwood, what do you say? Will you let me take you to your aunt's place?" "I would be grateful," she said, returning his smile. "Thank you." After breakfast, during which Thomas sat and chatted comfortably with the Pritchards about local matters, he led Josephine outside to where his horse and a small buggy were waiting. She looked at him in surprise. "I thought you might prefer this to riding," he said. "The roads are still pretty muddy, but the buggy will manage." "You are very thoughtful," she said as he helped her up onto the seat. He handed her his coat again, and when she protested that the sun was shining, he simply said, "The wind is still cool. Humor me." She put on the coat, breathing in the scent of leather and something else, something distinctly masculine that made her pulse quicken. He climbed up beside her, took up the reins, and clicked his tongue to get the horse moving. They rode in comfortable silence for a few minutes. The only sounds the creaking of the buggy wheels and the chirping of birds in the trees that lined the road. Josephine found herself intensely aware of Thomas's presence beside her, the way his hands handled the reins with easy competence, the way his profile looked against the blue sky. "How long will you be staying with your aunt?" he asked, breaking the silence. "I am not certain," she admitted. "It depends on how she is doing." The telegram made it sound quite serious, but Doc Pritchard said he had not been called, so perhaps she has recovered. "Sarah Jenkins is a tough woman," Thomas said. "She has lived out here alone since her husband passed 5 years ago, and she has managed just fine. Still, it will be good for her to have family nearby for a while. Do you know her well enough? She buys eggs and chickens from me sometimes, and I have helped her with a few repairs around her property over the years. She is good people." Josephine studied his profile. "You seem to help a lot of people, Mr. Norton." He glanced at her, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I just do what needs doing. That is how it works out here. You help your neighbors because you never know when you will need help yourself. Still, not everyone would stand in the rain to give a stranger their coat." His cheeks colored slightly, and she found the sight oddly endearing. "Anyone would have done the same." "I do not think that is true," she said softly. He did not reply, but his hands tightened slightly on the reins, and she saw a muscle jump in his jaw. They rode on, and gradually he began to point out landmarks and tell her about the area. He spoke about the creek that ran through his property, about the challenges of ranching in Texas, about the town and its people. His voice was pleasant, and Josephine found herself listening not just to his words but to the passion behind them. He clearly loved this land and this life, despite its hardships. "What about you?" he asked eventually. "What is life like in Houston?" "Busy," she said. "Crowded. I work as a seamstress in a dress shop, and I live in a boarding house with 5 other young women. It is a good life, but it is not like this." She gestured to the open land around them, the endless sky, the sense of space and freedom. "Do you miss it? Being here, I mean," she considered the question. "I grew up in a small town not unlike Trinity, though it was farther east. I moved to Houston 3 years ago after my parents died, because I needed work and my aunt helped me find a position. I have grown accustomed to city life, but I confess I had forgotten how peaceful the countryside can be." "Peaceful is one word for it," he said with a slight smile. "Lonely is another. Is it lonely for you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I have friends in town and I keep busy with the ranch, but there are times when the silence gets to be a bit much. I had always thought I would have a family by now, but life has a way of not going according to plan." "How old are you, if you do not mind my asking?" 27. "And you?" 23, she said. "So you have plenty of time yet to find whatever it is you are looking for." "And you?" she said, looking at him. 27 is hardly ancient. He laughed at that, a genuine sound that made something warm unfold in her chest. "I suppose not, though some days I feel ancient enough." They crested a small hill and he pointed ahead. "There is the Henderson place." Josephine looked and saw a modest house with a neat vegetable garden and a chicken coop beside it. Smoke rose from the chimney, and as they drew closer, an older woman emerged from the house, shading her eyes against the sun. "Josephine." Her aunt called, hurrying forward as quickly as her age would allow. "Oh, my dear girl, I was so worried when that young man came by last night saying you had been caught in the storm." Thomas brought the buggy to a stop, and Josephine climbed down to embrace her aunt. Sarah Jenkins was a small woman with gray hair and bright blue eyes, and though she looked older than Josephine remembered, she seemed in reasonably good health. "I am fine, Aunt Sarah," Josephine assured her. Thanks to Mr. Norton here, who rescued me from the storm." Sarah turned to Thomas, who had climbed down from the buggy and was standing with his hat in his hands again. "Thomas Norton, you are a blessing. Come inside, both of you. I have coffee on and biscuits fresh from the oven." "I should be getting back," Thomas began, but Sarah waved away his protest. "Nonsense. You will come inside and let me thank you properly for taking care of my niece." He glanced at Josephine, who nodded encouragingly, and he followed them into the house. The interior was cozy and well kept, with handmade rugs on the floor and cheerful curtains at the windows. Sarah bustled about, pouring coffee and setting out biscuits with butter and jam, all the while peppering Josephine with questions about her journey and her life in Houston. "I am sorry the telegram worried you so much," Sarah said as they sat around the kitchen table. "I had a bad cold that settled in my chest, and Mrs. Morrison from town was so concerned she insisted on sending for you. But as you can see, I am well on the mend." "I am glad to see it," Josephine said, covering her aunt's hand with her own. "But I am happy to be here regardless." "I have missed you. And I have missed you, dear girl. How long can you stay?" "I have 2 weeks before I must return to Houston. My employer was kind enough to give me the time." "2 weeks," Sarah repeated, looking pleased. "That is wonderful. We will have a proper visit." Thomas finished his coffee and stood. "I really should be going now. Miss Norwood, Mrs. Jenkins, it was a pleasure." "Wait," Josephine said, rising as well. "Your coat." She had been wearing it the entire time, she realized, and she slipped it off reluctantly. "Thank you again, Mr. Norton." "I owe you a great debt." "You owe me nothing," he said, taking the coat. His fingers brushed hers as he did so, and she felt a jolt of electricity at the contact. From the way his eyes widened slightly, she thought he might have felt it too. "Will you come by again before I leave?" She heard herself ask, then felt her cheeks warm at her own boldness, but he smiled, and it was like the sun coming out. "I would like that very much, if it is all right with you, Mrs. Jenkins." "You are always welcome here, Thomas, you know that," Sarah said. "In fact, we are having supper tomorrow evening around 6. Why do you not join us?" "I would be honored," he said. He looked at Josephine again. "Until tomorrow, then." "Until tomorrow," she echoed. After he left, Sarah turned to Josephine with a knowing look. "That is quite a young man." "He is very kind," Josephine said, trying to sound casual and failing entirely. "Kind, handsome, hardworking, and clearly smitten with you," Sarah said. "I saw the way he looked at you, dear, and unless I am very much mistaken, you looked at him the same way." "Aunt Sarah, I only just met him yesterday." "And sometimes that is all it takes," Sarah said gently. "I knew your Uncle Henry for only 3 days before I knew I would marry him. The heart knows what it knows, Josephine. The question is whether you are willing to listen to it." Josephine did not know how to answer that, so she changed the subject and began asking her aunt about the farm and the neighbors. But throughout the rest of the day, as she helped with chores and unpacked her small bag, her thoughts kept returning to Thomas Norton and the way he had stood in the rain to give her his coat. That night, lying in the small guest room that had once belonged to her uncle, she stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of her feelings. She had known the man for less than a day. It was ridiculous to feel this flutter in her chest whenever she thought of him, this anticipation at the prospect of seeing him again tomorrow. She had a life in Houston, a job, friends. She could not simply abandon all of that because a handsome cowboy had been kind to her in a storm. But even as she thought it, she knew she was lying to herself. This was more than simple gratitude or passing attraction. There had been something in the way he had looked at her, something in the way she had felt safe and cared for in his presence, that spoke of deeper possibilities. She fell asleep with his name on her lips. The next day passed in a pleasant blur of domestic tasks and conversation with her aunt. Sarah was indeed much recovered from her illness, and Josephine suspected the older woman had simply been lonely and perhaps wanted an excuse to see her niece. They cooked together, tended the garden, and talked about everything from Josephine's life in Houston to memories of her parents. As 6 o'clock approached, Josephine found herself growing nervous. She had brought only one good dress suitable for dinner, a green cotton with cream-colored trim, and she changed into it with care. She brushed out her dark hair and pinned it up in a simple but flattering style, then looked at herself in the small mirror and wondered what Thomas would think. "You look lovely," Sarah said from the doorway, making her jump. He is going to be speechless. "I am not trying to impress anyone," Josephine protested weakly. "Of course not," Sarah said with a smile. "That is why you have changed your dress 3 times in the last hour." Before Josephine could respond, they heard the sound of a horse approaching. Her heart began to race, and she pressed a hand to her stomach to calm the butterflies that had suddenly taken flight there. Thomas knocked on the door precisely at 6, and when Sarah let him in, Josephine saw that he too had taken care with his appearance. He wore clean trousers, a pressed shirt, and a vest, and his dark hair was still damp from washing. He held his hat in one hand and a small bouquet of wildflowers in the other. "Mrs. Jenkins, these are for you," he said, offering the flowers to Sarah. "And Miss Norwood, you look beautiful." "Thank you," Josephine managed, feeling her cheeks warm. "You look very nice as well." Dinner was a relaxed affair, with Sarah doing most of the talking and regaling them with stories about life in Trinity and the various characters who populated the town. Thomas contributed his own observations, and Josephine found herself laughing more than she had in months. There was an ease to the conversation that felt natural, as though the 3 of them had been sharing meals together for years, rather than this being only the 2nd time she and Thomas had met. After dinner, Sarah claimed fatigue and retired to her room, leaving Thomas and Josephine alone in the parlor. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, and then Thomas spoke. "Would you like to take a walk? The sunset should be pretty tonight, and the air has cooled down nicely." "I would like that," she said. They walked out into the evening, the sky painted in shades of gold and pink and purple. Thomas offered his arm, and she took it, feeling the strength of him beneath the fabric of his shirt. They followed a path that led toward the creek, and the sound of running water grew gradually louder. "I am glad you came to dinner," Josephine said. "I enjoyed your company very much." "I enjoyed yours as well," he said. "Your aunt is a wonderful woman, but I confess I came mostly in hopes of seeing you again." His honesty made her breath catch. "I was hoping you would come," she admitted. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Miss Norwood, I know we have only just met, and I know you have a life back in Houston that you must return to. But I find myself wanting very much to know you better, to spend whatever time you have here with you if you will allow it." "I want that too," she said softly. "Very much." "I do not want to presume anything," he continued. "I just want you to know that I have not been able to stop thinking about you since yesterday. I know that probably sounds foolish." "It does not sound foolish at all," she said, reaching up to touch his cheek. "I have been thinking about you too, Thomas." He turned his head slightly so that his lips brushed against her palm, and the gesture was so tender that she felt tears prick at her eyes. Then he took her hand in his, and they continued walking, their fingers intertwined. They talked as they walked, sharing stories from their pasts, their hopes for the future, their fears and dreams. Thomas told her about his parents, about how hard it had been to lose them both at once, about the loneliness of keeping the ranch going by himself. Josephine told him about her own losses, about the challenges of making her way in Houston, about the sense that something had been missing from her life, without her quite being able to name what it was. Maybe it was this, she said quietly as they stood by the creek, watching the water flow past. Maybe it was you. He looked at her with such intensity that she felt it like a physical touch. I think maybe I have been waiting for you, he said. I just did not know it until you appeared in that storm. He kissed her then, soft and gentle and full of promise, and she kissed him back with all the longing and hope that had been building in her heart since the moment he had draped his coat around her shoulders. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, and she rested her forehead against his chest. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. "I have to go back to Houston in 2 weeks." "I know," he said, his arms tight around her, "but let us not think about that right now. Let us just be here together, for as long as we can." She nodded, and they stood there by the creek as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear overhead. The days that followed were the happiest Josephine could remember. Thomas came to the Henderson place every day, sometimes staying for just an hour or two, sometimes remaining from morning until night. He helped Sarah with repairs and heavy chores, always finding some excuse for his presence, though they all knew the real reason he was there. He took Josephine riding through the countryside, showing her his ranch and introducing her to his horses and cattle. He taught her to rope, laughing when her first attempts ended with the lasso landing nowhere near its intended target. They went on picnics by the creek and spent hours talking about everything and nothing. Sarah watched it all with a mixture of happiness and sadness, knowing that her niece was falling in love, but also knowing that Josephine's time in Trinity was limited. She said nothing, however, allowing the young couple to find their own way. 1 week into Josephine's visit, Thomas took her into town to show her around properly. Trinity was a small place, with a main street lined with shops and businesses, a church, a school, and a saloon. Everyone seemed to know Thomas, and he introduced Josephine to what felt like half the population. They stopped at the general store, where the proprietor, Mr. Haverson, greeted them warmly. "Thomas Norton, I have not seen you in town this much in years." "Must be good reason for it," he said with a wink at Josephine. "This is Miss Josephine Norwood," Thomas said, and the pride in his voice was unmistakable. "She is visiting from Houston." "Pleased to meet you, miss," Mr. Haverson said. "You planning on staying long?" "Just another week," Josephine said, trying to keep her voice light despite the sudden heaviness in her chest. "That is a shame," Mr. Haverson said. "We could use more pretty young women in Trinity. Place is overrun with cowboys and not much else." They left the store with Thomas carrying a few supplies, and as they walked down the street, Josephine noticed the way people looked at them, the speculative glances and knowing smiles. It was clear that word had spread about Thomas Norton courting Sarah Jenkins's niece from the city. "Does it bother you?" Thomas asked quietly, noticing her observation. "People talking, I mean." "No," she said honestly. "I am proud to be seen with you." He smiled at that, a genuine expression of pleasure that made her heart skip. "The feeling is entirely mutual." They had lunch at a small restaurant where the owner, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Murphy, fussed over them and insisted on bringing them extra dessert. As they ate, Thomas grew more serious. "Josephine, I need to talk to you about something." Her stomach clenched with anxiety. "All right. I know you have to return to Houston in a week. I know you have a job there, a life. But I need you to know that these past days with you have been the best of my life. I have fallen in love with you, and I am not ashamed to say it, even though we have known each other such a short time." "Thomas," she breathed, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Let me finish," he said gently. "I am not asking you to give up your life or make any promises you are not ready to make. But I want you to know that if you ever decide you want something different, if you ever want to come back to Trinity, there will be a place for you here, with me, always." Tears filled her eyes. I love you too, she said. I did not think it was possible to feel this way so quickly, but I do. I love you, Thomas Norton. Then stay, he said urgently, gripping her hand tighter. Do not go back to Houston. Stay here and let me make you happy. Let me build a life with you. I want to, she said, and the words came out almost as a sob. But I have responsibilities. I have a contract with the dress shop, and the owner has been good to me. I cannot just leave her in the lurch with no notice. And I have no savings, Thomas. I would be completely dependent on you, and that is not fair. I do not care about fair, he said. I care about you. I know, and I care about you too. That is why I need to do this right. Let me go back to Houston and settle my affairs. I will give proper notice at the shop, pack up my belongings, say goodbye to my friends. It should take no more than a month, maybe 2 at most. And then, if you still want me, I will come back to Trinity. He studied her face. If I still want you, Josephine, I will want you every day for the rest of my life. Then wait for me, she said. Please, just a little while longer. He was silent for a long moment, and she could see the conflict in his eyes. But finally he nodded. I will wait for you. I would wait forever if that is what it takes, but you have to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that you are coming back. That this is not just a gentle way of saying goodbye. I promise, she said firmly. I am coming back to you, Thomas. Nothing could keep me away. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, and she saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Then I will count the days until I see you again. The remaining week passed far too quickly. Josephine spent her days helping her aunt and her evenings with Thomas. They talked about the future, about the life they would build together, about the ranch and what it would be like when she came to live there. He showed her the house he had built with his father, pointing out where he could add rooms as their family grew. The casual mention of children made her blush, but it also filled her with a warmth that spread through her entire body. On her last night in Trinity, Thomas took her to his ranch for dinner. He had spent the day cooking, and though the meal was simple, beef and potatoes and vegetables from his garden, it was one of the best she had ever eaten. After dinner, they sat on his porch and watched the sun set over the land that rolled away in gentle waves toward the horizon. He had his arm around her, and she leaned into his warmth, memorizing every detail of this moment. I am going to miss you so much, she said softly. I will miss you too, but it is not goodbye. It is just until we meet again. Until we meet again, she repeated, liking the sound of it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. I want you to have this, he said, placing it in her hand. She unwrapped it carefully and found a delicate silver locket. She opened it and saw that inside was a tiny photograph of Thomas, and beside it, a lock of his dark hair. I know it is not much, he said, but I wanted you to have something to remember me by. It is perfect, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Will you help me put it on? He fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers gentle against her skin. She touched the locket, feeling the weight of it against her heart, and knew she would never take it off. I have something for you too, she said. She had spent the previous evening embroidering a handkerchief with his initials, working by candlelight after her aunt had gone to bed. It was not much, but it was made with love, and she hoped he would treasure it. He took it from her with reverence, running his fingers over the careful stitches. Thank you, he said. I will carry it with me always. They kissed then, long and deep and desperate, knowing it would be their last kiss for many weeks. When they finally pulled apart, both of them had tears on their cheeks. Write to me, he said, please, as often as you can. I will, she promised. Every week, I swear it, and you will come back. I will come back, I promise you, Thomas, I promise. The next morning, he drove her into town to catch the stagecoach to Houston. Sarah came too, hugging Josephine tightly and whispering in her ear to be brave and to follow her heart. The stage was already waiting, the driver loading luggage, and Josephine knew she had only moments left. "I love you," Thomas said, holding her close. "Do not forget that." "I could never forget," she said. "I love you too, so much." One final kiss, and then she was climbing into the stage. She took a seat by the window and pressed her hand against the glass. Thomas stood on the boardwalk, his hat in his hands, watching her with an expression that made her want to leap out of the coach and run back to him. The driver cracked his whip, and the stage lurched into motion. Josephine kept her eyes on Thomas until he was nothing but a distant figure, and then until he disappeared entirely. Only then did she let herself cry, pressing her face into her hands as sobs shook her body. "There, dear," said an older woman sitting across from her. "I am sure whatever it is will work out." But Josephine could not speak. She could only clutch the locket at her throat and pray that she had made the right decision. The journey back to Houston felt interminable. Every mile took her farther from Thomas, farther from the life she wanted, and closer to the life she was trying to leave behind. She spent the trip composing mental letters to him, rehearsing what she would say to her employer, planning how quickly she could tie up the loose ends of her city life. When she finally arrived in Houston, exhausted and travel-worn, her friends at the boarding house greeted her with surprise and questions. She told them about her aunt's recovery, but said nothing about Thomas, not yet. That felt too precious to share, too fragile to expose to their curiosity. The next morning, she went to see Mrs. Blackwell, the owner of the dress shop. The woman listened with pursed lips as Josephine explained that she needed to give notice, that she would be leaving Houston in 6 weeks. "This is very sudden, Miss Norwood," Mrs. Blackwell said, "and highly irregular. We had an agreement." "I know, and I apologize," Josephine said, "but my circumstances have changed. I am willing to work extra hours to help train my replacement, and I will make sure all my current projects are completed before I leave." Mrs. Blackwell studied her for a long moment. "Is there a man involved in this decision?" Josephine felt herself blush but met the older woman's eyes steadily. "Yes, there is, but that is not the only reason I am leaving. I miss the countryside, the sense of space and community. Houston has been good to me, but it is not where I belong." Something in Mrs. Blackwell's expression softened. "Very well, 6 weeks it is, but I expect you to keep your word about training your replacement and finishing your current work." "I will," Josephine promised. "Thank you for understanding." "I do not understand," Mrs. Blackwell said. "But I was young once, and I remember what it is like to have your head turned by a handsome face. I just hope he is worth it." "He is," Josephine said with conviction. "He absolutely is." That night she wrote her first letter to Thomas. She told him about her journey, about her conversation with Mrs. Blackwell, about how much she already missed him. She told him that she was counting down the days until she could return to Trinity, and that every night she fell asleep holding the locket he had given her. She received his first letter 3 weeks later, and her hands shook as she opened it. His handwriting was neat and precise, and his words made her cry with their simple honesty. He wrote about the ranch, about the foal that had been born the day after she left, about how empty the house felt without her in it. He wrote that he loved her, that he was counting the days just as she was, that he could not wait to make her his wife, his wife. The words sent a thrill through her. He had not formally proposed, but the intent was clear, and she knew that when she returned to Trinity, it would not be long before they married. The weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Josephine worked long hours at the dress shop, training a young woman named Margaret who would take over her position. She sorted through her belongings, selling what she could and packing the rest. She said goodbye to friends, to the life she had built in Houston, and though there was sadness in the partings, there was also relief. She was going home, even though she had never lived in Trinity. She was going to where her heart was. She wrote to Thomas every week, and his letters came just as faithfully. They talked about their plans, about where they would live, and what their lives would look like. He told her about improvements he was making to the house in preparation for her arrival. She told him about fabrics and curtains and all the small touches she wanted to add to make the place feel like home. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, her last day at the dress shop arrived. Mrs. Blackwell presented her with a bonus and a recommendation letter, just in case things did not work out in Texas, and Josephine hugged the older woman with genuine affection. "Be happy, child," Mrs. Blackwell said. "That is all that matters." "I will be," Josephine said. "I promise." She left Houston on a bright morning in early autumn, her trunk packed with everything she owned in the world. The journey to Trinity was just as long as she remembered, but this time, every mile brought her closer to Thomas rather than farther away, and that made all the difference. When the stage finally pulled into Trinity, she pressed her face to the window, searching for him. And there he was, standing on the boardwalk in almost the exact same spot where she had last seen him. Their eyes met through the glass, and the smile that broke across his face was like the sun rising. The stage had barely stopped before she was scrambling out of it, her carefully maintained composure forgotten. Thomas met her halfway, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around as she laughed and cried at the same time. "You came back," he said against her hair. "You really came back." "Of course I did," she said. "I told you I would, I promised." He set her down but kept his arms around her, and she could feel the tension draining out of him, the fear he had been carrying that perhaps she would change her mind. "I love you," he said. "God, I love you so much." "I love you too," she said. And then they were kissing, right there on the main street of Trinity with half the town watching. She did not care, and clearly neither did he. Finally, reluctantly, they pulled apart. Thomas retrieved her trunk from the stage driver, and they walked together toward where his wagon was waiting. But before they could leave town, they were intercepted by Doc and Mrs. Pritchard, who greeted Josephine with delight. "Welcome back, dear," Mrs. Pritchard said. "We are so glad you decided to return." "Thank you," Josephine said. "It is good to be back." "Now, where will you be staying?" Mrs. Pritchard asked with a knowing look. "With your aunt, I presume?" "Yes," Thomas said firmly. "Until we are married, which will be as soon as possible if Miss Norwood will have me." He said it loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, and Josephine felt her cheeks warm even as her heart soared. "I will have you," she said softly, "whenever you want. How about Sunday?" He said, only half joking, "I have waited long enough." Mrs. Pritchard laughed. "Give the poor girl time to settle in, Thomas, though I will say that Pastor Williams could probably marry you next week if you are both agreeable." Josephine looked at Thomas, at the hope and love in his eyes, and made her decision. Next week would be perfect. The look on his face was worth everything, all the uncertainty and waiting and fear. He kissed her again, quick and hard, and then helped her into the wagon. They drove to the Henderson place, where Sarah was waiting on the porch. The older woman's face lit up when she saw them, and she hurried down the steps to embrace Josephine. "I knew you would come back," Sarah said. "I knew it in my bones." "I could not stay away," Josephine said. "This is where I belong." That evening, over dinner, they made plans for the wedding. It would be simple, just a ceremony at the church with a small gathering afterward. Josephine did not care about elaborate decorations or a fancy dress. All she cared about was becoming Thomas's wife. The week passed in a blur of preparations. Mrs. Pritchard helped Josephine alter one of her better dresses to serve as a wedding gown, adding lace and ribbon to make it special. Sarah baked cakes and pies for the celebration. Thomas cleaned his house from top to bottom and made sure everything was perfect for when he brought his bride home. On Sunday morning, Josephine woke before dawn, too excited and nervous to sleep. Sarah helped her dress and arrange her hair, weaving wildflowers through the dark strands. When Josephine looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the glowing woman staring back at her. "You are beautiful," Sarah said with tears in her eyes. "Your parents would be so proud of you." "Thank you, Aunt Sarah," Josephine said, hugging her, "for everything. For bringing me here, for welcoming Thomas, for supporting us." "It is my joy," Sarah said. "Now let us get you to that church before your young man thinks you have changed your mind." The church was small and simple, with wooden pews and windows that let in the morning light. It was packed with people, the entire town of Trinity having turned out to witness the wedding. Josephine walked down the aisle on her aunt's arm, but her eyes were only for Thomas, who stood at the front with Pastor Williams. He looked more handsome than she had ever seen him, in a dark suit with his hair neatly combed, and his gray eyes fixed on her with such intensity that she felt it like a physical touch. When she reached him, he took her hand, and she felt the slight tremor in his fingers, the evidence that he was as moved and nervous as she was. Pastor Williams spoke about love and commitment, about the sacred bond of marriage and the journey they were embarking upon together. Josephine heard the words dimly, aware mostly of Thomas's hand in hers, of the steady beat of her heart, of the sense that this was the moment her entire life had been leading toward. When it came time for the vows, Thomas's voice was strong and clear. "I, Thomas, take you, Josephine, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, to honor you, to cherish you, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, until death do us part." Josephine repeated the words, her voice shaking slightly but filled with conviction. "I, Josephine, take you, Thomas, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, to honor you, to cherish you, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, until death do us part." Thomas slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, and she did the same for him. And then Pastor Williams was pronouncing them man and wife, and Thomas was kissing her, and the church erupted in applause and cheers. They walked back down the aisle together as husband and wife, and Josephine felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. Outside, people threw rice and offered congratulations, and Thomas helped her into the wagon for the ride to his ranch, to their home. The celebration that followed was joyful and boisterous, with food and music and dancing. But as the afternoon wore on, Josephine found herself growing impatient to be alone with her husband, to begin their life together in earnest. Thomas must have felt the same way, because as the sun began to set, he made their excuses and helped her back into the wagon. The ride to the ranch was quiet, both of them content to sit close together, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. When they arrived, he lifted her down and then, to her surprise, scooped her up in his arms. "What are you doing?" she asked with a laugh. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," he said. "It is tradition." He carried her into the house and set her down gently in the parlor. The room glowed with lamplight, and she saw that he had filled it with wildflowers, their sweet scent filling the air. On the table was a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Thomas," she breathed, looking around, "this is beautiful." "Not as beautiful as you," he said, taking her hands. "Josephine Norton, I cannot believe you are really here, that you are really mine." "I am yours," she said, stepping closer to him. "And you are mine, for always." They made love that night with tenderness and passion, discovering each other with wonder and joy. And afterward, lying in his arms in the bed they would share for the rest of their lives. Josephine thought back to that stormy day when she had stumbled into Trinity, cold and frightened and alone. She thought about Thomas standing in the rain, giving her his coat without hesitation, and how that single act of kindness had changed both of their lives forever. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, running his fingers through her hair. "About the day we met," she said. "About how lucky I am that the stage broke down, that the storm came, that you found me." "I am the lucky one," he said. "You gave up your entire life to come here and be with me." "I did not give up anything," she said firmly. "I found everything. I found home. I found love. I found you." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret that choice." "I could never regret it," she whispered. "Never." The months that followed were the happiest of Josephine's life. She threw herself into making the ranch house a home, sewing curtains and quilts, planting a garden, learning how to cook the hearty meals Thomas needed after long days working with the cattle. She proved adept at ranch life, helping with the horses and even learning how to rope and brand under Thomas's patient instruction. The townspeople welcomed her warmly, and she made friends quickly. Mrs. Pritchard and Sarah became her closest confidantes, and she often visited with them while Thomas was working. She also started a small dressmaking business, taking in alterations and making clothes for the women of Trinity. The extra income was helpful, but more than that, it gave her a sense of purpose and connection to the community. That first winter was harsh, with snow and ice that lasted for weeks. But Josephine found she did not mind. The ranch house was warm and cozy, and there was something deeply satisfying about weathering the storms in Thomas's arms, knowing they were building a life together that could withstand anything. In the spring, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Thomas one evening after dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment he just stared at her, and then a look of such pure joy crossed his features that she started to cry. "A baby," he said, pulling her into his arms. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" She asked, though she could already see that he was. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," he said. "Josephine, you have made me the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Josephine found the summer heat exhausting in her condition. Thomas was endlessly solicitous, constantly worrying about her and trying to make sure she did not overwork herself. Sarah and Mrs. Pritchard were fonts of advice and support, and Doc Pritchard checked on her regularly. In October, after a labor that lasted through the night and into the next morning, Josephine gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Thomas was there for the whole thing, holding her hand and wiping her forehead, and when Doc Pritchard finally placed the baby in her arms, she saw tears streaming down her husband's face. "He is perfect," Thomas whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Samuel, after Thomas's father, and he had dark hair like both his parents and gray eyes like Thomas. From the beginning, he was a good baby, content and curious, and Thomas proved to be a devoted father. Josephine would often find him in the nursery late at night, just watching Samuel sleep, a look of wonder on his face. The next few years brought more changes. The ranch prospered under Thomas's careful management, and they were able to hire a couple of hands to help with the work. Sarah's health began to decline, and she eventually moved to the ranch so that Josephine could care for her. The older woman delighted in her great-nephew and spent hours telling him stories and singing him songs. When Samuel was 3, Josephine became pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after Thomas's mother. She had her mother's dark hair and delicate features, and from the moment she opened her eyes, She had Thomas wrapped around her tiny finger. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Josephine and Thomas's love for each other only deepened with time. They had their challenges, certainly. There were droughts that threatened the cattle, illnesses that swept through the family, and the general hardships of frontier life. But they faced everything together, and their commitment to each other never wavered. Sarah passed away peacefully one night when Samuel was 5 and Margaret was 2. She died in her sleep, with Josephine holding her hand, and her last words were that she was grateful to have seen her niece so happy. They buried her in the Trinity cemetery, next to her late husband, and the entire town turned out for the funeral. The years continued to pass. Samuel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the ranch and followed his father everywhere. Margaret was more outgoing and adventurous, constantly getting into mischief and making her parents laugh. When Samuel was 8, Josephine gave birth to twins, boys they named David and Jonathan. The house was full of noise and chaos and love, and Josephine could not imagine a better life. Thomas proved to be as good a father as he was a husband. He was patient and kind, but also firm when necessary, teaching the children about responsibility and hard work while also making sure they knew they were loved. He taught Samuel and the twins to rope and ride, and he never treated Margaret any differently, ensuring she learned all the same skills her brothers did. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Josephine into town for dinner at Mrs. Murphy's restaurant, leaving the children with a neighbor for the evening. It was rare for them to have time alone together, and Josephine treasured every moment. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked as they lingered over coffee. "Leaving Houston, giving up the life you had there?" Josephine reached across the table to take his hand. "Not for a single moment. Thomas, you and the children, the ranch, this life we have built together, it is more than I ever dreamed of having. I am so grateful that the stage broke down that day, that I was caught in that storm, that you found me. I think about that day sometimes," he said, "about how easily we might have missed each other. If the stage had not broken down, if I had been working on a different part of the ranch, if I had not decided to ride into town that afternoon. But we did not miss each other," she said. "We found each other, and that is what matters. I love you," he said, "more now than I did 10 years ago, if that is even possible." "It is possible," she said softly, "because I feel the same way." They went home that night and made love with the passion of newlyweds, but also with the deep comfort and familiarity of a decade together. And the next morning, they woke to the sounds of their children laughing and playing, and Josephine thought that there could be no greater blessing. The children continued to grow. Samuel, at 16, was nearly as tall as his father and already talking about taking over the ranch someday. Margaret, at 13, had become a skilled seamstress under her mother's tutelage and was making beautiful quilts and dresses. The twins, now 8, were inseparable troublemakers who kept everyone on their toes. Trinity itself had grown over the years. The railroad had come through, bringing new opportunities and new people. There was now a proper school with a trained teacher, a larger church, and several new businesses. Thomas had become a respected member of the community, serving on the town council and helping to mediate disputes. Josephine was equally valued for her kindness and her skill with a needle, and she had trained several young women in dressmaking over the years. But despite the changes, some things remained constant. Doc and Mrs. Pritchard were still fixtures in the community, though they were older now and moved more slowly. Mrs. Murphy still ran her restaurant, and Mr. Haverson still owned the general store. And Thomas and Josephine still visited Sarah's grave regularly, bringing flowers and telling her about the children and how the ranch was doing. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Josephine by taking her back to the spot where he had first kissed her, by the creek on Sarah's old property. The place looked much the same, though the trees were larger and the creek bed had shifted slightly over the years. "Do you remember standing here that first week?" he asked, holding her close. "When we barely knew each other, but somehow already knew we loved each other. I remember everything about those days," she said. "How scared I was that it was too soon, that I was being foolish. How much it hurt to leave you and go back to Houston. And how it felt when you came back, like coming home," she said simply. "Like everything in my life finally made sense." He kissed her then, and it was like being young again, like that first kiss all those years ago. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Josephine Norton," he said. "You and our children and this life we have built. I would not change a single thing." "Neither would I," she said. "Not one single thing." As they stood there by the creek, the sun setting behind them and the sounds of their children calling them home in the distance, Josephine thought about the strange and wonderful path that had led her to this moment. She thought about the storm that had brought her to Trinity, about the cowboy who had stood in the rain to give her his coat, about the love they had built together through work and faith and commitment. She thought about how easily she might have missed all of this, might have lived her entire life in Houston never knowing what she was missing. But fate or fortune, or perhaps simply kindness, had intervened, and instead she had found everything she had never known she wanted. "We should get back," Thomas said reluctantly. "The children will be wondering where we are." "In a minute," she said, holding him tighter. "Let me stay here just a little longer. Let me remember." "Remember what?" "Everything, all of it, how lucky we are, how perfect this is." He held her as the last light faded from the sky, and when they finally walked back to the wagon hand in hand, Josephine knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. They had weathered storms before, both literal and figurative, and they would weather whatever came next. The years continued to unfold in their steady rhythm. Samuel married at 22, bringing home a sweet young woman named Emily, who quickly became like a daughter to Thomas and Josephine. They built a house on the far edge of the ranch property and started their own family. Margaret, to everyone's surprise, fell in love with the new schoolteacher, a gentle man named Robert who appreciated her intelligence and independence. The twins, now grown men, worked the ranch alongside their father and older brother, and there was talk that they might eventually expand the operation. Thomas and Josephine became grandparents, then grandparents again and again. Their house was constantly full of children and grandchildren, of noise and laughter and love. Thomas's hair turned gray, and lines appeared around Josephine's eyes, but they both remained strong and active, continuing to work the ranch and serve their community. On their 30th anniversary, they threw a big celebration at the ranch, inviting everyone they knew. The whole town seemed to turn out, and there were speeches and toasts and dancing. Samuel stood up and talked about his parents' love and commitment, about how they had built not just a ranch but a legacy. Margaret read a poem she had written about her mother's strength and grace. The twins, never much for words, simply raised their glasses and said that they hoped someday to find what their parents had. As the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Thomas and Josephine found themselves alone on the porch, sitting in the rocking chairs they had bought years ago. The stars were bright overhead and the air was cool and pleasant. 30 years, Josephine said softly. Where did they go? Right here, Thomas said, gesturing to the land around them, to the house behind them full of sleeping grandchildren. They went into building this, into loving you and raising our family and making a life worth living. I would do it all again, she said. Every single day exactly the same way, Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, they made the good parts that much sweeter. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds of the ranch. After a while, Josephine rested her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, just as he had done on that first wagon ride into town so many years ago. "You remember what you said to me that night?" she asked. "After you gave me your coat, I said a lot of things that night. You said you had been soaked before and would be soaked again, as if standing in the rain was nothing, as if my comfort was more important than your own." "It was," he said simply. "It always has been." "That was when I started to fall in love with you," she said. "Not when I saw your face or heard your voice, but when I realized you would give up your own comfort without hesitation for someone you did not even know. That is who you are, Thomas Norton. That is who you have always been. And you are the woman who came back to me, even though it meant giving up everything familiar and safe. That is who you are, Josephine Norton, brave and strong and true." They sat there until the moon rose high in the sky, talking about the past and the future, about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch and the town and all the ways their lives had intertwined with this place. And when they finally went inside to bed, they fell asleep in each other's arms, just as they had done for 30 years. More years passed, marked by the seasons and the cycles of ranch life. There were births and deaths, weddings and funerals, triumphs and setbacks. Through it all, Thomas and Josephine remained each other's constant, their love the foundation upon which everything else was built. When Thomas was 60 and Josephine was 56, he fell ill with pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. For a few terrible days, Josephine feared she might lose him, and the thought was unbearable. She sat by his bedside day and night, holding his hand and talking to him even when he was too feverish to respond. She told him about their life together, about all the moments they had shared, about how much she still needed him, and he fought his way back to her, determined not to leave her alone. When he finally opened his eyes and saw her sitting there, tears streaming down her face, he managed a weak smile. "I am not going anywhere," he whispered hoarsely. "I made you a promise 33 years ago, until death do us part, and I am not ready for that yet." "You had better not be," she said, half laughing and half sobbing. "I am not finished with you yet, Thomas Norton." He recovered slowly but completely, and after that scare, they both became more aware of the preciousness of time. They made a point of telling their children and grandchildren that they loved them, of not putting off visits or conversations. They sat on the porch more often, watching the sun set over the land they had worked together for so long. On their 40th anniversary, the family threw another big celebration, even larger than the one 10 years before. There were grandchildren and great-grandchildren now. 3 generations of Nortons gathered to honor the love story that had started with a storm and a coat and an act of simple kindness. Samuel, now in his 40s and running the ranch with his brothers, stood to make a speech. "My parents have shown us all what love looks like," he said. "Not the easy, romantic kind you find in books, but the real kind. The kind that gets up before dawn to tend sick animals and stays up late to comfort crying babies. The kind that works together and dreams together and builds together. They have given us the greatest gift parents can give their children. They have shown us what it means to commit to another person completely and to honor that commitment every single day." Josephine found herself crying, and Thomas put his arm around her, pulling her close. "He is right, you know," he said quietly in her ear, "about all of it. We have been blessed," she said, "so very blessed." As the party continued around them, they slipped away for a few moments of quiet. They walked down to the barn, where the horses nickered softly in greeting, and then beyond to the pasture where the cattle grazed under the stars. "You ever think about what would have happened if we had not met?" Josephine asked. "Sometimes," Thomas admitted. "I think I would have lived my whole life without really understanding what I was missing. I would have worked the ranch and probably eventually married someone suitable, but it would not have been like this. It could not have been. I would have stayed in Houston," Josephine said. "Probably worked at the dress shop until I was too old, lived in that boarding house or one like it. Maybe married eventually, maybe not. But I would never have known what it was to be truly, deeply loved. I would never have had our children or built this life. The thought of it breaks my heart." "Then we should be grateful," Thomas said, "for every moment, every day, every year we have had together." "I am," she said, "more than I can ever express." They stood there in the darkness, holding each other, and Josephine thought about that girl who had stumbled into Trinity 40 years ago, cold and frightened and lost. She thought about the cowboy who had given her his coat and stood in the rain, and about how that single moment had changed everything. The years that followed were quieter. Thomas and Josephine gradually stepped back from the day-to-day running of the ranch, leaving it in the capable hands of their sons. They spent their days tending Josephine's garden, visiting with friends and family, and simply enjoying each other's company. They were content in a way that only comes from a life well lived and a love well tended. When Thomas was 75 and Josephine was 71, they celebrated their 53rd wedding anniversary quietly, just the two of them. They had lunch on the porch, reminiscing about their life together, and in the afternoon they took a slow walk around the property, visiting all the places that held meaning for them. 53 years, Josephine said, shaking her head in wonder. More than half a century. "Best 53 years of my life," Thomas said. "Every single one of them. Even the year the drought nearly ruined us. Or the year Samuel broke his leg and we thought he might not walk again. Even those years," he said firmly, "because we faced them together. Because you were beside me through all of it." That night, lying in bed, Josephine felt a profound sense of peace. She had lived a good life, a full life, surrounded by love and purpose. She had known true partnership, had raised children who were good and kind, had built something lasting and meaningful. Not many people could say that. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I will love you forever, Thomas Norton." "And I love you," he replied, his arm tightening around her. "My Josephine, my wife, my everything." They fell asleep in each other's arms as they had done for more than 50 years. Time continued its inexorable march, but their love remained constant. They grew older but no less devoted, their bond only strengthening with age. They watched their grandchildren grow up and have children of their own, saw the ranch prosper under the careful stewardship of multiple generations, and took pride in the legacy they had built together. Through it all, they never forgot that rainy day in 1878 when their paths had crossed, when a cowboy had stood in the rain to give a shivering stranger his coat. It had been such a small gesture, really, the work of a moment. But from that moment had grown a love that had endured for more than half a century, a family that now numbered in the dozens, and a partnership that had weathered every storm life could throw at it. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the land they had worked together for so long. Sometimes they talked, sharing memories and dreams. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, their hands clasped together, finding peace in each other's presence. "Do you know what I am most grateful for?" Josephine asked one such evening when they were both in their late 70s. "Tell me," Thomas said. "That I listened to my heart, that I had the courage to leave everything behind and come back to you. It was the scariest thing I ever did, but it was also the best. "You made me whole," Thomas said. "Before you, I was just going through the motions, existing but not really living. You taught me what it means to love and be loved, to build a life with someone who is truly your partner in every sense." "We taught each other," she said. "That is what love is, I think. Not finding someone who completes you, but finding someone you can grow with, someone who challenges you to be better while loving you exactly as you are." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, just as he had done so many times over the years. "My wise Josephine." "Your stubborn Josephine," she corrected with a smile. "After all, I did uproot my entire life for you. And I stood in the rain and gave you my coat," he said. "So I suppose we are even." They laughed together, the sound carrying across the peaceful evening. In the distance, they could hear their great-grandchildren playing, their voices high and joyful. The ranch was thriving, the family was happy, and they were together. What more could anyone ask for? As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Josephine rested her head on Thomas's shoulder, and he pulled her close. They sat like that until the moon rose, two people who had found each other against all odds and had built a life of love and purpose together. Their story, which had begun with a storm and a simple act of kindness, had become something beautiful and enduring, a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and commitment. And when they finally went inside for the night, they walked hand in hand, their steps slow but steady, still partners after all these years, still in love after more than 5 decades. They had weathered many storms together, both literal and figurative, but they had always emerged stronger for it, their love deeper and more resilient than ever. As they prepared for bed, Josephine looked at Thomas, at the lines on his face that told the story of their life together, at the gray hair and the hands that had worked so hard for so many years. She saw not an old man, but the young cowboy who had given her his coat, the devoted husband who had stood beside her through joy and sorrow, the loving father and grandfather who had helped build something precious and lasting. "What are you looking at?" he asked with a smile. "You," she said simply. "Us. This beautiful life we have made. It has been beautiful, has not it?" he said, taking her hands in his. "Every moment with you has been a gift." They climbed into bed, and as they had done for over 50 years, they fell asleep in each other's arms, grateful for another day together and hopeful for many more to come. Outside, the stars shone down on the ranch, on the land they had worked together, on the legacy they had built, and on a love story that would be told and retold by their descendants for generations to come. The story of how a cowboy stood in the rain to give a shivering woman his coat, and how that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that had lasted a lifetime and beyond. A love that had created a family, built a home, and proved that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the smallest gestures of compassion. And for Thomas and Josephine Norton, that adventure had been worth every moment, every challenge, every joy. They had found in each other not just a spouse but a true partner, a best friend, a soulmate. And that, they both knew, was the greatest blessing of all,